Today, a Jets analyst will explain why Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey are off to a promising start, even if they don't get immediate results. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, August 5th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we are joined by Michael Nania, who works over at JetsXFactor.com. Michael's been a longtime friend to this podcast. We're going to talk about the offseason the Jets had and look forward to the 2025 season. Let's jump into my conversation with Michael right now. Joining me today is an old friend of the show, Michael Nania, who is with JetsXFactor.com. Michael, welcome back.
Great to be back as always.
It's been quite a while since we've spoken. A lot's happened in the Jets universe since then. So I guess we can begin by just talking about overall impressions, first off season, Aaron Glenn, Darren Mougey. What in particular stuck out to you?
Yeah, I think what stood out to me, or kind of the overarching theme that we gathered from their, not just their press conferences and comments, but their free agency, their draft, and I feel like even the way camp has been run so far, it really feels like that there is a mindset of trying to build something sustainable. They largely avoided long-term contracts in free agency, only had a couple of them, only one for at least 3 years. In the draft, stayed put with their picks. Were pretty, didn't really chase, like they could have went for a quarterback, didn't do that, stuck with the offensive line, or they could have taken a skill player, went offensive line. Just there are a lot of different examples of things that I think point to the way that they want to do this patiently, and they want to build a culture and just an ability to have this team competing on a yearly basis for years to come. It's not about competing this year. It's not even about opening a window next year or in 2 years from now or any specific set of years. I think it's about finding a way to make up for the mistakes that put the Jets in the position that they are now, and taking a very patient and economical route towards putting them in a new position where they can compete on a yearly basis, like your Ravens and Bills, Chiefs, Steelers, these type of organizations. I think that is what they're striving towards. And I think there have been some short-term costs to that. I think there are a lot of ways that, they could have improved the team more this year that they didn't, for the sake of achieving this goal of sustainability. But I think it's a refreshing change of pace after the last couple of years, for sure.
Yeah, so I'll give you my thoughts on this. Is the first thing that comes to mind for me is, when you have a new head coach, a new GM, you don't really know how good they're going to be based on the first off season. So we're very judging on very limited data. But the first thing that sticks out to me is they got all the obvious stuff right, which has not always been the case with new Jets regimes. And I mean, I could start with the decision to move on from Rodgers. And I don't know how you felt about this. I thought it was crazy that anybody thought they could bring back Rodgers, after the way the last 2 years have gone. And I think there are lots of elements to that. But at the top of the list is just, I think there's this hesitancy in the national media to admit that Rodgers is not close to being the quarterback he used to be. And I was surprised, how big of a push there was in certain areas to try it one more time with Rodgers and Adams and all those guys. And my view is just this failed, and it was time to move on. And I thought that was the first move they had to make, and they did it in a pretty drama-free way. This was not like they took 3 months to do. So I don't know how you felt about that, but for me, that was number one. Is they did the obvious thing and moved on from an experiment that did not work.
Yeah, I was completely on the same page. It was not a debate for me at all. And I was surprised that it was the same way as you, because it seemed like we had seen more than enough to know that the ship had sailed on that, and that the Jets weren't in a position. Not only were the Jets not in a position, but Rodgers is not the player to put the Jets straight into a Super Bowl window the way that they thought he would. And like, who knows how differently it goes if he doesn't get injured and all of these hypotheticals. But we saw 17 games of him last year. And despite some, the Steelers fans are buying in right now. I'm looking forward to them seeing the reality of this situation. But we saw a 17-game example of Rodgers being a below average starter. That's not to say he was atrocious or the only reason the Jets struggled last year. Far from it. But he's a below average starting quarterback at this point. And I think it's obvious based on his metrics, or if you just watch him and some of the ways he's regressed compared to his peak, which is not surprising for a 41-year-old quarterback coming off an Achilles. So it was obvious to me. And I think especially from the standpoint of, the Jets hit the reset button at head coach, at general manager, all across the regime. And I think corresponding that with a quarterback change, especially when you're talking about a quarterback of this magnitude, from just the weight that they carry in the locker room, I think it just made perfect sense to hit the reset button on that and definitively make this a new era. I don't think Rodgers is close to the player that he would need to be to justify having that overlap and kind of lingering effect of the past couple seasons when the Jets are trying to integrate something new with a new head coach and general manager. So to me, it was pretty obvious. And the fact that they did it so definitively, it doesn't really seem like it was much of a thought for Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey. Was, like you said, the fact that something so obvious felt very obvious to them, I think is encouraging.
Yeah, and like I think like there was like this perception in the certain elements of the fan base, certain elements of the media that like you can pick and choose which parts of Rodgers you wanted. Like we can pick like the guy who was the MVP in Green Bay, but we won't take all the baggage. We won't take the McAfee stuff. He'll be, he won't be a guy who makes a lot of, and it just wouldn't work. You're taking the full package with Rodgers. And one thing I'll say is like, I don't blame Rodgers for this, because I think like this happens with every great quarterback. Like you get accustomed to being treated a certain way. I think Rodgers performed at, he was one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. And when you play at that level, you get accustomed to certain perks. You get accustomed to being the most important guy in the franchise. And I think that's a tough thing to ask him to step away from, especially, after 2 years where the Jets kind of gave him everything he wanted. I think I'm not sure the Pittsburgh situation is going to work. I'm kind of pessimistic on it, but I think it's different where he's going into Pittsburgh as a new guy versus, the guy who was really even though he didn't do a whole lot with New York, he was the face of the franchise here for 2 years. And I think that's a really tough thing it would have been a tough thing to ask him to just kind of step aside and, play second fiddle to Aaron Glenn. So I didn't think there was any plausible way they could make it work with him. So I just thought it was a move that had to be made.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you mentioned, because I don't think it's because Rodgers is the worst guy in the world or anything, or that it has anything to do with that. It's just there's a level of I would call it respect, but just like a level of attention that is naturally going to come alongside a player like that when they've reached this stage of prestige and success in their career. And for a first-time head coach who is inheriting a team that's missed the playoffs 14 years in a row, there has to be some sort of new standard. And like we use that culture word a lot, but I do think it is like an important piece of how a lot of these franchises establish that consistency. And when you're trying to do that, it's just hard when, even if Rodgers tried his absolute best to stay in the background and let Glenn do his thing, he's still Aaron Rodgers, and his voice is just going to carry more weight, not just in the media, but I think to a lot of players in that locker room compared to a rookie head coach. So I think establishing that, pecking order in a very clear way by removing Rodgers from the picture is a big factor in allowing Aaron Glenn to do, some of the things even right now that we're seeing in the early parts of training camp, the way that the intensity has been ramped up, the praise that he's gotten from his own players about the accountability. It feels like all of these things would be a lot more difficult to enforce with a player like Rodgers overshadowing all of it. So I was always very much on the side that they needed to move on. So I was encouraged to see it, happen so smoothly and quickly.
This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. It's the best time of year. NFL kickoff is almost here, and that means fantasy football season is back in full swing. And this year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, me and Locked On Jets are playing Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. I've used Yahoo Fantasy for over 20 years, and the updates they're rolling out this month are wild in the best way. Ahead here on the show, Michael and I are going to talk about Justin Fields. Maybe he's a fantasy play for you. Well, no matter whether or not you draft Fields or any other Jets, to celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. And to kick it off, they just dropped the Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now it's time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. If you're more into the classics, you can still play head-to-head in private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. The other part of this offseason that I really loved, and you've way back when you wrote on my website, so you've been hearing me say this for like a decade. Is like how much I think that when you have good players, you need to extend them and keep them around for the second contract. And they did. Like, I was really surprised. I thought they were going to let Jamie and Sherwood go, and I was delighted that they brought Jamie and Sherwood back. And then the Sauce extension, the Garrett extension, and with the Jets, it's never easy. Like, even when I remember like 2 years ago with Quinn and Williams, they got the contract done, but it just dragged on way longer than it needed to. And again, it was like, it's not that hard. Like, these guys are good players. These guys are part of your core, and they kept them. And it's something that I think should be obvious, but it hasn't always been obvious to the Jets. So this was a second thing that like left me really encouraged with how they handled the offseason.
Yeah, I mean, we arrive at training camp with all these players extended. It's just done and over with. There's no drama. It's really promising. But yeah, I think extensions are some of the best money that you could spend as an NFL team, because as opposed to signing, say, a player of the same talent level for the same money from another team, when you extend a player that has already performed well on your team, it's just a lot more reliable to expect him to continue performing, because you've seen it in this environment. Now, obviously, the Jets have a new coaching staff, new schemes and everything, but just to know that you're paying for players who have performed in this city, this environment, this set of teammates, it's really sustainable and reliable. So like you said, it should be the biggest no-brainer to commit that type of cap space to a known commodity in the case of these three players that Jamie and Sherwood a little less so than Garrett and Sauce, obviously, but coming off a great year, trending up, really obvious decision. So I'm always a fan of spending that money on extensions versus letting that player go and you have all this extra cap space, but now you got to replace that guy on someone who's probably not as reliable.
Right, you pretty much have to spend all your cap space to get a new guy in here anyway. And I also think like there's like, this is just a theory, but I do think there's something to the idea like these guys have equity with the Jets. They're fighting for their teammates, and this is an extreme example, but it's like, I think if Hassan Reddick had stayed with Philadelphia last year, he probably would have had a good year, because like he had equity with all of his teammates there. He comes to the Jets, he just wants to get paid, and you could tell he was just kind of like mailing it in. So I think like there's something to the idea that like guys are going to fight harder for teammates they've battled with for years, and I just think that's it's something that's been lacking with the Jets. So first of all, I mean, part of it's the Jets really haven't had a lot of good players to extend up to now, but I was just really happy with the way things played out this offseason. I completely agree with you. I think that's some of the best money you can spend.
Yeah, and I think it aligns with some of the things, like the principles that we talked about Glenn and Mougey clearly wanting to emphasize as well. I think that sustainability can come from the continuity of keeping players on your team for a long period of time, and they're just in a. And I think, like I said, I think scheme matters. We'll see. The Jets have new schemes and everything, but I really think there's something to just knowing the city you're playing in, being in the same home, same stadium, with teammates that you've known. There's just a lot of reliability to knowing that Sauce Gardner has succeeded with the New York Jets for 3 years. Garrett Wilson has done it for 3 years, and you could bank on that for the foreseeable future. versus like bringing in a new player. So definitely, I think it is a good complement to what the Jets, and it also sets a precedent too. It shows younger players like, hey, if you perform well here, we are willing to reward you and extend you. And I think it helps in that way as well. So I think they've done a good job with some of these, not little things, but it's not as flashy to extend a player as it is to sign or trade for a new player for the same money. But I think some of these things are some of these more subtle ways that they built up the roster this season, even if it's not flashy or adding to the roster, I think have really complemented some of the principles that they seem to be focusing on as they try to rebuild this foundation.
And one other small point is just like these contracts don't kick in until 2027. So essentially you got these guys like for 2025 rates, and their contracts don't kick in for 2 years when the salary cap is going to be way higher. So, it's a little advantage, but it's going to be a little extra money to spend. But let's move on now. Quarterback, Justin Fields. So my views on Fields are kind of nuanced because I feel like it's probably not going to work out. And like, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I also felt like he was probably the best option. He was probably like the best upside play the Jets had. And I'm kind of curious your thoughts on Fields.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of routes that I thought the Jets could have gone. It didn't seem like there was anything realistic in the draft via, no one who was a justifiable pick at 7 if they reach for it. No one to trade up for, really. So it didn't seem like there was a draft option. So it felt like all they could really do was going into free agency. Would we either roll with Tyrod Taylor or maybe throw another similar veteran into that mix, whether it's a Marcus Mariota, someone like that, either that or go for Justin Fields. I felt like those were the only options. And I did see the appeal of that other route of just Taylor plus another veteran, because you could stay cheaper and just accept like it's a stopgap year. Maybe these guys could lead us to be competitive, even if they're not the future. But Fields, I think there is a lower floor with him than, a Tyrod Taylor brings to the table outside of injuries, because, Tyrod does have injury concerns, but there's a floor with Fields. I mean, he's not been a great player in the league and has not won games at a high level. But I think the reason you make this signing versus just rolling with Taylor, signing another veteran, whatever it may be, it's just for that, whatever number you want to put on it, 10%, 15% chance that he could still have that breakout in him to be the player we thought he was coming out of college when he was a top 11 pick. That's why you do it. That's why you give him the $30 million guaranteed for 2 years, is just to tap into that last chance. Because I think we've seen enough around the league the last few years to believe that quarterbacks of this caliber can break out at this point in their careers, whether it was Sam Darnold last year, Geno Smith, Baker Mayfield. Like, we've seen some of these examples of late breakouts from quarterbacks. And I think a guy like Justin Fields, who's physically more talented than all of those guys, it's easy to, as a coaching staff, believe in your player development and see a guy like that and think we could give him the best chance another chance to succeed if we build the right environment around him. So yeah, I think it was the best move for the sake of giving them some semblance of a chance of getting a franchise quarterback this year versus just punting it with a stopgap. But at the same time, similar to you, while acknowledging all of that, I'm also not super optimistic that it's going to happen, because we've seen a good body of work of Fields without a ton of progress. Training camp, camp is camp. It's a new situation for him, but it's been a mixed bag so far. So I think it's just going to be more of the same if I were to predict it, but I still think it was the right move just because they gave themselves some chance that they could find a franchise quarterback in him, as opposed to just punting it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and like for me, like I judge the front office on results over the long run, but over the shorter run, I kind of look at it: are they making the right kinds of bets? And like the first 3 or 4 years Joe Douglas was here, there were some successes, but there were a lot of failures. But it always felt to me like the plan was pretty good with Douglas the first couple of years, so I was always kind of on the side of giving him more time. And then near the end, I felt the process was not quite as good. And especially for like a first year head coach and GM, they can only do so much to turn over the roster. So the question it becomes for me, like, is this the sort of mindset? Are they making the sort of moves that over the long run, if you make these moves, if you make these types of moves 3, 4, 5 years, you're eventually going to strike gold? And I think the answer to that is potentially, this first year with Glenn and Mougey. I think if they have more types of these off seasons, they might actually, it might work out for them. I mean, I'm never going to guarantee like a new regime is going to work out because we don't know, but I think the process behind these moves is very sound. And if you make these types of moves, you give yourself a shot to succeed.
Yeah, I think that's another theme throughout this offseason is a lot of like upside bets, and Fields being the most notable of them at quarterback. But I just feel like across the roster, the players they signed are a lot of guys who might not have reliable track records in the league, haven't been consistent starters, but there's something there, whether it's their athletic traits or a small sample of production that you can bank on. Like, even their smallest free agent signings, Stone Smart last year started a few games and was really productive as a starting tight end for a few games. Or Byron Cowart is later in his career, but he got a role with the Bears last season and he was very productive in the game, with the snaps that he had. So players like that, and then you even go into the draft with, Armand Membu in the first round. I think that's a very athletic, high upside tackle. And then throughout the draft, they picked a lot of great athletes. You get Arian Smith, a guy who is has tremendous speed and overall athleticism, but drop issues. So they've gotten a lot of these players who have workable traits, but more technical type of things that they're trying to fix. And, most of these, probably the majority won't work out because it's not easy to fix drops or teach Justin Fields to be able to go through his progressions. Not all of that is going to be fixed, but I agree that the process, if maintained over the long run, should lead to a good percentage of hits. If they coach them correctly, have a good scheme, scout well, they're taking calculated bets that don't compromise the cap space or, the flexibility, but also have very promising upside for what they're investing into them. So that I feel like has been a theme of this offseason as well.
Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. If you're like me, sometimes your finances go on autopilot. You sign up for a subscription that you don't use and you kind of just forget about it. Monarch Money can help you out with that and so much more. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year.
Yeah, I think heading into this season, generally speaking, people view the skill positions as a weakness. And I feel like every day, I have a different view on how it's going to go. So interested to get someone else's take on this. How do you see this skill group shaking out?
Yeah, I think the receiver position is one that they kind of punted on, I would say, this offseason, in the sense that, they didn't take an approach this offseason of trying to fill every single hole. It was, they're trying to recover from the last 2 years of moves from Douglas. They're trying to get younger. So that's definitely one of the positions that I feel like are just accepting isn't going to be great this year. But I think their hope is that they could work around it with being a run-first offense, Justin Fields leaning heavily on not just Garrett Wilson as the top receiver, but I think Mason Taylor will probably be second in targets. And I think the running backs are going to be heavily involved. So I think they're kind of banking with the wide receivers that, in terms of their short-term plan for success this season, that, again, run first offense, we're going to pepper Garrett Wilson, and we're going to get the tight ends and running backs involved. And then the rest of the receivers hopefully can have their niche roles, whether that's Arian Smith as a deep threat, Corley, we'll see if he can carve something out as a gadget guy. Jamal Pritchett has been interesting. He's been standing out as a slot guy in camp, but I would say the plan is something along those lines. But obviously, in the long term, going into next offseason, I think wide receiver is going to be up there as probably the top need, because I don't think it's sustainable to compete with this type of receiver unit for anything serious. But in the meantime, I think that's probably what their mindset is in terms of how to split those targets around, I would say.
Do you think Corley's going to make the team? I'm not convinced.
I think he's going to sneak in just based off the lack of competition, because I think there's enough spots for him there to where he won't be surpassed, to where they'll keep him for the potential. But there's just not much happening to really bank on. Nothing last year that camp, preseason, regular season, pretty much nothing. I think it was a very poor sign for him that a regime that not only drafted him, but traded up for him and was publicly very vocal about their excitement for him, were so unimpressed with him on the practice field that they put him in the doghouse. And now you have a new regime that he has to impress, and we're still not seeing much. So I wouldn't be surprised if he missed the roster. I'm going to lean towards yes, just because third round pedigree, it's a thin receiver room, but I wouldn't be surprised if he missed it.
I think the problem is, like, I think Arian Smith may end up getting like his gadget, his touches in space, and I think it's tough to make a living when like you're a guy who tries to make plays in space, but you aren't super fast or super elusive. And I mean, like, the way I always view like Joe Douglas's regime was like there was good Joe Douglas, which was getting maximum value out of Jamal Adams and Sam Darnold and drafting Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner. And then there was bad Joe Douglas, which was, sometimes he just really lock in on some prospect and think that, he found a sleeper where maybe he should have been a little bit more open-minded to other prospects. And like, I know like it was a joke, but, apparently like in the draft room that night when they traded up for Corley, he and Saleh were, using the line from the Costner movie, no matter what. And
yeah,
I think like the issue with Corley for me is just that, like, he doesn't do like any of the stuff like a receiver needs to do. He was a guy who caught a lot of screens in college, and like he's still very like early, he's still not super advanced running routes. And like even in this group, like I just don't. I've said this, like I think Corley's best shot would be to maybe have like a Cordarrelle Patterson type transition and become like a running back receiver hybrid rather than kind of like starting from scratch at wide receiver. But problem with the Jets is that the running back room is actually pretty good right now, so I don't know that he'd have a spot there.
Yeah, and I think he was also in addition to all the yak stuff, I just think this is a high third round pick that they traded up for. I feel like you want a more complete receiver, and these types of guys don't really pan out a lot. It's easy to point to Deebo Samuel, but he's an exception. There's a lot of Treylon Burks was just waived, I think, is a similar type of prospect, and he was a first round pick. Just you want to see with the receiver prospects the ability to contribute in a bunch of different ways, because if there's only a few different packages where you could be effective, and there are ones where you get the ball, you're just not going to be on the field a lot. And then when you are in the field, teams are going to key in on you. So it's just hard to find a role for him. And another thing with Arian Smith that I think kind of adds to what you said about taking Corley's role is that he's good blocking film from college. And it's something that they've already been praising him for, the coaches speaking to the media. So that's just another way that he can get on the field over a Corley. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was released. I still kind of feel like he'll stay on the roster just for the sake of it, but I definitely wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, and like full disclosure, like I was not a huge fan of the Smith pick when they drafted him, but he's like the one guy I think actually has the talent to potentially be like a quality number 2 receiver on the team, because I think Josh Reynolds is really a number 3 receiver. I mean, he may end up in the number 2 role. Lazard is Lazard. I mean, enough. We don't need to talk about Lazard. And so like I don't see like anybody else who's like really a great option to be like the number. So I don't know if Smith is going to be a good, but he's like the one guy I think who has like the potential ability to be a decent number 2 for this team. So there's a lot on him. You don't want to bet on like a fourth round pick stepping in and immediately contributing as a number 2 receiver, but he's kind of the guy I have my eye on, and he's apparently having a strong camp so far. So Arian Smith is my hope.
Yeah, I was similar to you. Once that pick was made and I looked into it a little bit more, I was not a huge fan at first because, I think drops are something that are one of the harder things to fix in a prospect because I'm just not sure how much more you could be taught about that. I just feel like it's kind of something you have or you don't. And he struggled with it to not just a little bit, but he had 3 more drops than anyone in the SEC last year. So it was to a very high level. And, for a 4th round pick, I kind of felt like it was a little early for such a big gamble on someone who has such significant drop issues. But as I looked into him more, I feel like what set him apart for me is I feel like he's not just a deep threat. He's not just even in his athletic profile, it's not just the 40, but he was great in the explosiveness drills, the quickness. And then when you watch his film, I think you see flashes of him as a route runner being quick and explosive, as well as being able to do the vertical stuff. So I think there is, like you're saying, potential for him to be a true number 2 receiver, and not just, you put this guy in to run a go route and that's all he does. So I do see that ceiling with him. I'm definitely, we got to see when the games start if he could curb the drop issues, because I think it's a whole different animal to avoid dropping passes in a real game versus training camp. So, he might still struggle with it regardless of training camp. I think we still have to wait and see on that. But I've definitely come around and seen the vision on it a lot more the more I've looked into him. So the ceiling is legitimately exciting. It's just, none of it matters if you can't catch the ball. So we still have to see if he could respond to that in game.
Right, ceiling is ceiling. That doesn't mean lots of players have high ceilings. They don't always hit it, but I do think like this. Like going back to Fields, like I do think like this group of skill players is why Fields needs to be the quarterback over a Tyrod Taylor, because Tyrod Taylor is like, all the cliches about veteran quarterbacks, like, he'll know where to get the ball. He'll, get you in the right play. But I know he's mobile, but I don't think he's going to like even like in his prime in Buffalo, he wasn't a guy that like produced a lot of explosive plays on his own. He was a guy who just kind of got the ball where it needed to go and protected the ball. And I don't think there's a ton of playmaking ability in the skill. I mean, you have Breece Hall, who's obviously a big playmaker, and maybe Smith can channel that speed, but Fields with his legs, actually, it does like add a decent amount of playmaking. You got to have splash plays in this league. I just don't think, I think Tyrod Taylor would go in and be competent, but I don't think you'd see a lot of splash plays in the offense. And I mean, I don't know if you will with Fields, but I do think there's more potential for it with Fields in there than Tyrod.
Yeah. And I think, he's like a scramble runner. I think any plays that they have in the playbook for Fields to actually run, that are run for him or he has the option to run, I don't think Taylor is running those. He didn't even do it a ton early in his career. At this point, I don't think he would. So, I think there's a higher floor. Like, it depends on how good the Jets defense is. I feel like if the Jets defense is really good, then a Tyrod Taylor, like even the 2023 Jets, I feel like a lot of those losses could have flipped just by having a guy who doesn't throw interceptions, which he's very good at, and is generally accurate quarterback who just doesn't make a lot of negative plays. He doesn't add a ton. He's a great deep ball, but for the most part, he's pretty conservative. So like if you're a great defensive team, then someone who doesn't get in the way is pretty important. But I'm not sure how great the Jets defense is going to be this year because they do have a lot of holes on that side of the ball as well. But so for that reason, I think that ceiling of Fields is more valuable. And it's just the fact that, Tyrod is who he is. But with Fields, I think they're just committed to that, taking that dice roll of maybe he puts it all together and is a franchise quarterback at this point. There's still some percentage of a chance. And I think for a team that's not trying to win a Super Bowl this year, it's worth tapping into that chance, however small it is.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks so much to my friend Michael Nania for joining us, and he'll be back tomorrow. We'll continue our discussion about the 2025 Jets, but for now, that's all. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow with more Michael Nania. Can't wait to chat with you then.